Okay, folks, for this month's newsletter, I'm just going to go over the new page of the Hebrew biblical calendar real quick because I've never really gone over it with everybody. And it's not rocket science, it's pretty simple stuff, but we'll go over it fast, and that'll be this month's newsletter. I'm doing this mainly because the day you get this newsletter is going to be, Saturday, I think the 15th. And that evening is the beginning of Pentecost, or Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, and that happens this month. So we'll go over the calendar real quick and talk about it, and we'll talk about some earth knowledge, and we'll talk about the holy days that were given to Moses and the Israelites by God at Mount Sinai a little bit. So let's just start with the calendar, and first of all, the Hebrew calendar starts with the month of Aviv. And Aviv is a Hebrew word that has multiple meanings. It means spring, it means harvest, and it means a condition of the grain. And it's used with regard to the calendar as a condition of grain, and it's when the grain, the barley, is not completely ripe but not green anymore. It's just about ready for harvest. It's green ripe. And that is the condition of Aviv. And that's when they start their year. That's their Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year. Their new year starts when the barley is Aviv in the land of Israel. Now, the reason for that is that it's the first crop that ripens in the spring, and that's when they've always started their year, so that's when they do it. And that's how God told them to do it when He spoke to Moses and gave them the calendar. So the first month is Aviv. The second month, most of you probably got a calendar page last month because we made it available to you, and we're just going to do that page by page. We'll post the month's calendar page each month for the newsletter. So that's their beginning of month. We've been past another month now. Now we're in the third month. So click on the link, get your copy of the calendar, and kind of follow along, calendar page. And so what we have here is 1 month of the Hebrew calendar, third biblical month. The Jewish month is called Sivan, so we can go ahead and call the Hebrew months Sivan. And you will note that it says 6,019. We are now 6,019 years after the creation of Adam, not the creation of the universe. The universe doesn't need a calendar. This is 6,019 years after the creation of Adam. Now, the reason why we keep this calendar, folks, is because God gave us the holy days with regard to the first month, the third month, the seventh month, etc. Well, our Gregorian calendar doesn't tell us anything about the first, seventh, or third month as calculated by the Israelites. We can't find the holy days. We don't know when to celebrate the holy days based on our current Gregorian calendar. You have to keep the Hebrew calendar just like God instructed Moses to keep it, or you cannot designate what days to celebrate the holy days. So it's a very important thing to do, and there are people doing it, and so that's why we have the calendar page. The Jews call it the year 5779. I believe that the 6019 is correct, and it corresponds this year with June and July of 2019 as we figure our Gregorian calendar. Okay, so the very top line, this sort of colored line here, is the days of the week on each calendar page of the Hebrew calendar. And they do not use Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. The reason is that those are the names of pagan gods. The sun god, the moon god, Tammuz was Tuesday, Tammuz Day. Odin was Wednesday. Woden is how they pronounced it, so it ended up being Wednesday, but it's Woden's Day. And then Thursday is Thor's Day. Friday is Freya's Day. Freya, the daughter of Semiramis in pagan fertility rituals. And then finally you have the god Saturn, and that's who is Saturday. So you had Sunday, Moon Day, Tammuz Day, Odin's Day, Thor's Day, Freya's Day, and Saturn's Day is how we figure it from the Gregorian calendar. But the Hebrews didn't pay any attention to pagan gods when they were doing right. The Israelites did not. So they just do first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and Shabbat. But Shabbat is just Hebrew for seventh. Just like Sabbath means seventh. But it just means the seventh, and it's the Sabbath. And it's in Hebrew, that's Shabbat. So, okay, those are the days of the week. Underneath that, we have night and day as designated per month. And so you have the moon and the sun, the moon, the sun, the moon, the sun, da-da-da-da. But right under that, you have a gray bar, and that is the Gregorian calendar line. And you will notice that on the Gregorian calendar, it starts in the middle of the night, because that's how our days are figured. We start at midnight and go to midnight. So each day of the Gregorian calendar, its little lines start and finish right in the middle of the night. Not so with the Hebrew calendar. The Hebrew calendar, you will note the lines start at the end of the day. And we start the Hebrew calendar at sundown, basically. However, in order for there to be a constant benchmark, 7 o'clock is usually used nowadays as the benchmark instead of sundown. Now, okay, that's the gray line. I'm going to go to the first little designation on the calendar, which is a new moon showing. And this month, folks, they did not sight the new moon on the first day of the month in Jerusalem. And because it should have been sightable, I'm assuming that's because it was overcast in Jerusalem. And when that happens, you just defer. You add 1 day to the previous month, and then you start your month the next day. So actually, on this calendar page that everyone got, if you clicked and got your free page, just move all the numbers over 1, because they were expecting to sight it. Because if you'll note those little numbers inside, every time you see a moon on the calendar, there's little numbers. Well, what those numbers designate, the first number is the percentage of brightness of a full moon. And so we had on June the 4th, when they couldn't see the new moon, it was bright enough. It was at 2.33% of the full moon, which is a pretty good sized little new moon. And it was 12.9 degrees above the horizon. So they expected to be able to see it. So it must have been overcast. Okay, now we go on and the months go, the days go. You don't have names of days, you just have numbers of days, and then you number the days. These yellow parts are all the Sabbaths. That's the 7th day going down the month. And what the new moon connotates, folks, is the moon is God's own way of counting the months, as obviously, since that's how he gave it to Moses. And it is in sync and in line and in harmony with the earth, the moon, the stars, and the sun. Our Gregorian calendar is not. It's all about the numbers. It's locked into the solstices and the equinoxes, and we add our little leap year so that we can create calendars and go by the numbers. And 2 years in advance, we can mark a number on the calendar, and it'll be on a Tuesday. And when 2 years passes, we can have our meeting, and it'll be on that number, and it'll be on a Tuesday. Well, there's too much flex in the Hebrew calendar. God wanted there to be flex in the Hebrew calendar. I'm not sure he wanted us planning things 2 years in advance, but even if they did, it's just a matter of how you express it. It's a matter of vernacular. Instead of marking a number and saying we'll meet on Tuesday the 14th in 2022, all you had to do was say, look, in 6022, per the Hebrew calendar, on the third month, in the second week, the second day of the second week of the third month, we'll have our meeting at such and such a place. And if you do that, it doesn't matter if there was flex in the first of the month. It doesn't matter if there was flex at the end of the year and they had to add a 13th month to reset the calendar, just like our leap year resets our calendar. It doesn't matter. When the time comes, the second week of the third month, on the second day, everybody will know what it is, and everybody will show up to the meeting at the right spot. So, Anyway, it's just as functional as any calendar we have, and it's very easy, especially with a calendar that designates our Gregorian calendar, to just keep two calendars side by side and live off both of them, because we do need to start doing these holy days, folks. These are the holy days that God gave to Israel and said that He would recognize Israel throughout our generations by these holy days, which means we are the lost tribes of Israel, but we're not keeping the holy days. So God is not going to acknowledge us as His chosen people until we start doing the things that He told us to do. And so that's why it's very important for us to do this. Now, in the middle of this month, actually, we are in the middle of this month. So if you're receiving this newsletter on Saturday the 15th, I believe it is, then tonight at sundown is the beginning of Shavuot, which is Pentecost. Pentecost means 50th, and it is the 50th day after the day of first fruits, which comes in the middle of the month of Aviv, the first month of the Hebrew year. And on the day of first fruits, they start counting the omer. And an omer is a quantity of wheat. And what they do is they take a band, they pull that quantity of wheat and they put a band around it, and it creates an omer, or it would be like a bushel, it's a measure of wheat. And they bind the omer long before they ever harvest it, because now it's bound into an omer. Now you come along with the scythe and you cut the wheat, and instead of it being everywhere, it's all bound into bushels already, and you just stack up the omer and go along. They didn't have these high-tech tractors that harvest and bind and everything all in one. So it was much to their advantage to go ahead and bind the wheat first, and then cut the wheat, harvest it, and then it was already in omer, and they could haul it away and store it. But that binding of the omer, we start on the day of first fruits and bind 1 omer a day for 50 days. And it's called the binding of the omer, and there is some symbolic significance to it, but I won't go into that right now. I just know that they do it, and it is symbolic, and it is somewhat of a ritual. And I wanted to mention that anyone who got last month's calendar page, there was almost nothing shown on last month's calendar, actually nothing except for the Sabbaths. And that's because after that first month, where they have the Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, first fruits, and all of their beginning of the year rituals and celebrations, that is the beginning of the barley harvest. And they harvest the barley, and it all revolves, because barley is the first crop that ripens in the spring. So it all revolves around the barley harvest. Next comes wheat, and then would come corn, and then the other crops as the year passes. But in this last month's calendar page, you didn't see anything, and that is because during that time, the Israelites were out in the fields. There were no holy days, there were no special Sabbaths, no ingathering days. No, it was all out in the fields harvesting, binding omer. And after they had bound the 50th omer of wheat on the 50th day, on Shavuot, on Pentecost, the ritual is over, and then they could go out and bind all the wheat and really start the harvest in earnest. But tonight will be the beginning of Pentecost. And what is Pentecost? What is Shavuot? Well, Shavuot means weeks, and so it's the Feast of Weeks, because it was 7 weeks of days, 49 days plus 1. And then you would have Pentecost, and Pentecost just means 50th. So it's the 50th day after the binding of the omer and the first fruits in the first month of Eve. And that is Pentecost. And what it designates is the actual day that the trumpets sounded on Mount Sinai, and God called the entire assembly with those blasting trumpets, and then spoke down the 10 Commandments. Now, we don't celebrate that on Pentecost. It's kind of a strange situation, folks. That was the day that it happened, but God wanted it celebrated in the 7th month, not the 3rd month. So we've always had the Feast of Weeks, but we celebrate the Day of Trumpets in the 7th month, the first day of the 7th month. Why do we do that? Because God knew that what that foreshadows in the future will not happen in the 3rd month. It's going to happen in the 7th month. And those trumpets will herald the return of Christ. And that will be his return appearance. And then Christ will disappear for about 15 days while the elect that are still living are gathered. And then about the 15th day, Christ and the elect will enter Jerusalem, and that will be the beginning of the millennium, and Christ dwelling with us. And that's what the Feast of Tabernacles designates. But that's in the fall, and now so is the Day of Trumpets. But the actual blowing of those trumpets originally occurred in the 3rd month on the day of Pentecost. It is the day when God himself, or the divine, hands the Holy Spirit off to mankind, and then mankind must disseminate it out across the world. It happened that day, and God told Israel, after he had given them the commandments, that if they would follow those and be his people, then he would designate us as a separate people and a nation of priests. And Israel agreed. And so that's what we have been. But now we're the lost tribes, and we've got to have a gathering of the lost tribes. And that's very important, so this calendar is very important. And once we have that gathering, we have to celebrate the holy days properly. And that too is what this calendar is about. But tonight, this Saturday night, as the sun goes down, that's the beginning of Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks. They had a big throwdown and feast. It was the ending of the binding of the Omer. They were about to start in full earnest on the wheat harvest. And they did remember the blowing of the trumpets and the 10 Commandments given. And then, of course, certainly after the 1st century, we always remember Pentecost, when it was kind of a parallel situation. The apostles were gathered in the temple, and God appeared in a totally different form than that of the Ancient of Days or that of the Son of God, the Son of Man, Jesus. That day, the Holy Spirit appeared as tongues of fire and hovered over the heads of the apostles, and they began to preach the gospel in foreign tongues, not gibberish, not a tongue unknown to all mankind. It was actual foreign tongues, because it was the feast of Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, and people were gathered from all over Israel around Jerusalem, and there were people from foreign countries and foreign places and villages and cities, and everyone heard the gospel preached by one of the apostles in their native tongue that was an actual language, and they heard it not just in the tongue but in the dialect and even the accent that was native to their area. So that was the day of Pentecost, and that's also what Shavuot represents, was the day of Pentecost. And that occurs this month on Saturday night, the 15th. Now, let me talk about the moon a bit. This is more earth knowledge, folks, so let's talk about this. You notice that the new moon is a little sliver of a new moon here. And the way God divides the months and the years, every month starts with the new moon. And it is by far the best way to designate the months, folks. When you see a new moon in the sky, and it's the sliver of a new moon that is curved to the viewer's right, that means it's a new month. That's a new moon. But that moon will start to wax, and when it becomes a quarter moon, curved to your right, to the viewer's right in the northern hemisphere, it is the end or beginning of the 2nd week, the end of the 1st week, beginning, it's the 1st quarter. When the moon is full, you're in the middle of the month. When you get the quarter moon that is curved to your left, to the viewer's left, from the northern hemisphere, then that is the 3rd quarter. You're at the end of the 3rd week, starting into the 4th week. And then the moon starts to wane more, and what that last sliver of moons are called are crescents. They're not a new moon, they're a crescent moon because they curve to the left. Now, in the southern hemisphere, this pattern is reversed. You know, when the moon is curved to your left, that's the new moon. When it's curved to the right, that's the crescent moon. And then you have your quarters and your full moon in the middle. But that designates an entire month and a perfect month. What that does, folks, is no matter what time period you live in, these months work, because back in the day, they didn't have Rolexes and they didn't carry calendars with them everywhere they went. And a lot of places where they went took months or weeks to get there. And so if you were traveling from Assyria to Egypt on foot, you would be able to keep track of where you were, what you were, without actually marking off each day. You could, every night, just look up in the sky. You'll know basically where you are. If it's, a quarter moon to curving to your right, we've been on the road 1 week. If you started at the first of the month, we've been on the road for 1 week. We're about 1 week in. When the moon is full, boy, we've been on the road for 2 weeks. We've only got 1 more week left. And then by the time you get to that leftward quarter moon, if it was going to take 3 weeks, you should be in Egypt. But you don't need a Rolex and you don't need a calendar. You can just look at the moon. And people spend a lot of time guarding sheep out in the fields and stuff, and working on harvest and working in the threshing floors. They didn't have watches. They didn't have calendars with them, but they could keep track of time by looking at the moon. And so can we as we go through the Hebrew calendar, because they start with a new moon every month. So let me talk about last month's calendar page just real quick and let you know something about it. Throughout this calendar, the specific days of the year-long ministry, it was 1 year, not 3 years. 3 years is erroneous tradition. It's dogma. It's leaven. But in this month, yes, all the Hebrews and all the Israelites were out harvesting. But this calendar also has all the benchmark days of Jesus' ministry noted. That 1 year that he was doing his ministry, Michael has put the day of the Sermon on the Mount, the day that he healed the 2 blind men in Jericho, the day that he healed the lepers. That kind of stuff is notated on this calendar. And yet Michael is so sort of glued in and clued into the way that Israel did everything. He's very much about the Hebrew roots of the Christian faith, that he kind of locked into what Israel does during the second month of the year, which is harvest. No holy days, nothing spectacular. But as far as Jesus' ministry, there should be some notations on here, because this is when Jesus was risen. This is after the Passover. So this calendar page from last month, that was the second month, should have on here, right about the second or the third, Jesus appears to the apostles in the mountains at Galilee. And then about 3 days later, Jesus appears to James, John, and Peter on the Sea of Galilee. They had gone back to fishing. And Jesus appeared to him and said, "You can't go back to fishing. You've got work to do. You got to go back to Jerusalem, and I'll contact you when you get back there." About halfway through this, there was an apostles' high council meeting. And their usual procedure was to get everybody at the meeting at their designated place, and then they would lock the doors and all the windows and seal the room to where no one could come in and no one could leave either until after the meeting was over. Well, somewhere in the middle about here, they had their high council meeting. Everyone arrived. They had all the doors sealed. And as soon as they had started the meeting, Jesus appeared out of thin air, even though the doors and windows were sealed. I believe that was the very meeting when Jesus let Thomas put his fingers in the holes in his wrist and in his side. And he spoke to them. He prayed over them. And as the meeting was ending, before the windows and doors were open, Jesus disappeared just as fast and quickly as he had appeared. So that happened. And then he spoke with Mary, Mary Magdalene, and Mary his mother again near Jerusalem. And then he spoke to Peter again near Jerusalem. So those things should have all, some of them at least, should have been. It's not like nothing happened in Jesus's life, because the risen Jesus was alive too. He wasn't dead. And his ministry wasn't quite over until he ascended. And you will note that on this month's calendar, that's the ascension of Jesus. But he didn't give us any of those appearances which were amazing. You know, that's some of the most amazing things that happened, was Jesus appearing to his disciples after his resurrection. So anyway, that's kind of the calendar, folks. That's the moon, how the moon works. Israel is going to start to celebrate these holy days. And once we do that, then we can go to the next step, which is to fulfill the prophecy of Ezekiel and go ahead and join the lost tribes of northern Israel with the tribes of Judah, which was southern Israel. And once we do that, my friends, then God says he will put his hand on that staff and he will use it as a powerful instrument to move things into position for the kingdom of God. And we want that to happen, my friends. So we need to get started on this. And let me tell you, the only option we have to getting started on fulfilling these prophecies is to decide that we're just not up for it. We're not smart enough. Kick the can down the road so that God will have to wait for another generation of people that are a little smarter, a little braver, and a little more willing, and then he'll be able to work with them, because this will be done. It's a matter of prophecy, folks. So why don't we be the instrument? Let's get started on these things and go forward. And that's going to end my newsletter, and we'll be talking more about this in the future. Just real quick, folks, I just wanted to give you the scriptures. If you want to read up, since we're talking about it today in the newsletter, if you want to read up on that great day that God sounded the trumpets from Mount Sinai and called all the assembly to the mountain and spoke down the 10 Commandments and all of that. If you want to read up about that, that's in Exodus chapter 19, and just start at the beginning of the chapter and go right straight through it. In the 3rd month, when the children of Israel were gone forth out of the land of Egypt, the same day came they into the wilderness of Sinai, for they were departed from Rephidim and were come to the desert of Sinai and had pitched in the wilderness, and there Israel camped before the mount. Okay, and if you want to read and get an idea about the holy days that God gave to Moses, that's going to be in Leviticus chapter 23, I believe, yes. And the Lord spake to Moses, saying, speaking to the children of Israel, and saying to them, concerning the feast of the Lord, which ye shall proclaim to be holy convocations, even these are my feast. And he goes into it right there, and you can read about it. That's Leviticus chapter 23. Now, understand that we don't do animal sacrifices anymore. That was fulfilled by Christ. And a lot of these rituals, we don't have to duplicate, but we do have to keep the days. And we do have to do some of the little rituals that designate and foreshadow future events. And like I say, if you want to read about the very first giving of the 10 Commandments and the first day of trumpets, which actually happened on this Saturday night on Shavuot, but we celebrate it in the 7th month, on the first day of the 7th month, and call it the Day of Trumpets. But that's in Exodus chapter 19, if you want to read in your Bible about a lot of the things that we talked about today. Okay, folks, thank you very much. I appreciate your time and your effort. Once again, God bless you all, and we will see you again next time. Bye.